This lecture introduces the ancient Greek civilization, beginning with the Geometric period and then moving into the Archaic era. Now, the Greeks are going to bequeath to Western civilization some of our most prized and fundamental beliefs and practices, such as philosophy, mathematics, geometry, and democracy. Now, the Greek world is going to play a role in this development, for they settle in a fairly inhospitable area in the Mediterranean, which then forces them to set up colonies and trade with others, thus developing early on skill sets that would diversify their civilization beyond merely agriculture and cattle raising or animal husbandry. Now, the Greek periods, if we are to glance at them here, from the Geometric era moving down to the Hellenistic era, are going to shift relatively rapidly from one style to the next as we move through these different historical eras. The reason for this rapid cycling through styles is the Greek belief in the nature of the universe and their belief in the gods merely being immortal humans. Therefore, their ideal will be capturing the perfect individual, as is evident by the rapid stylistic evolution in the dates from the Archaic period all the way through to the Hellenistic. As seen here, we see that the religious beliefs of the Greeks, because they differed so radically from that of the Egyptians or their Near Eastern counterparts, are going to have them strive for the perfect individual, because that individual, that Olympian, that perfect athlete, is going to look like and appear as a god. As mentioned with the Mycenaean civilization, the Greeks called Greece Hellas. Thus, they are the Hellenes, the Hellenic culture. Now, for the Hellenic culture, the gods that they believe in, they're a polytheistic civilization, but unlike the Near East and in Egypt, the Greek gods are merely immortal humans. They have the same wants and desires, the same foibles and weaknesses that all of us have. They, once again, can make love, they can get injured, they can suffer and feel pain. They are just merely much larger and more perfect than we are. Now, this leads to Protagoras and his axiom for the Greek civilization that man is the measure of all things. And this is very important for understanding the Greeks moving forward. They do not have god kings. There are no pharaohs. There is no representative of the gods on earth. This is a human-centered world, centered in the materialistic aspects of this world. Humans control their own destinies. Now, this is going to come from the Greek creation myth and how we actually got here, according to the ancient Greeks, which is very different than the Egyptians. At the beginning, we find, just like in Sumerian civilization, in Hebrew, in the Christian tradition, and in ancient Egypt, that there is darkness. In this case, Nyx, a big black bird representing darkness, lays an egg. Out of this egg emerges Eros, or the erotic forces of nature that will later become Cupid for the Romans. He makes the two halves of the egg, the earth and the sky, fall in love. That being, the earth will be known as Gaia, who's still worshipped today in many religions, while the sky hovering above is going to be Uranus. Eros makes them fall in love, and they produce the first generation of gods known as Titans. The Titans are going to be giants. They're massive and are an older, cruder generation of gods. The leaders of the Titans are Kronos and Rhea, and as the leader of brother and sister, they are going to mate and give birth to the household names of the Olympians, that being Zeus, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and others. They then come together and overthrow their parents, the Titans, and make way for man. So we know that Zeus has Prometheus create man in the god's image, and then, of course, give them talents that are associated with the different gods. The full family tree of Greek mythology can be seen here, and we have an entire class on classical myth, should you wish to know more, as we begin with Chaos and Nyx, and then create the Titans from Gaia and Uranus. And then we find from the Titans, as they are overthrown, we have the Olympians. But there are a host of family trees that offshoot from these various sections of the family tree that we will talk about as we move on. Thus, cosmology, the pantheon, and the Greeks' understanding of where the gods are and how the world was created all are bound together in this conception of the universe that they would pass on to the Middle Ages and Christians. So the space that is delineated finds Olympus at the topmost, Gaia, or Mother Earth, is in the middle, and Tartarus makes up the bottom of this spherical universe. Now, because the Greeks lacked farmland and soil that is appropriate for agriculture and sustaining a large population, that means they had to import food, trading in ceramic wares, and developing technology early on to survive. In fact, the trade that they would set up extended to various colonies throughout the Mediterranean, from Italy, Sicily, all the way to Spain, Ionia, in Asia Minor, down to Africa. Now, the Greeks give us many important characteristics, ideas, and practices in our civilization. For the city-states are going to emerge in the archaic era known as polis. In them, we find that Corinth rises first, and then Athens in the 6th century BCE. These city-states are ruled democratically by demos and or people. That's what a demos is. It's going to be someone who can vote in the civilization. They can participate in assembly, speak in public, own property, vote, hold office, and go into the army or navy. Only citizens can do these things, and those are going to be property-owning males, so much like America in the early 19th century. Therefore, it is not a perfect system, but a monumental leap forward from the oligarchies and monarchies that have been popular up to this point in history. Think of ancient Egypt, where one man is going to hold power over a vast civilization. The Greeks are going to begin their civilization by adopting motifs and ideas from their neighbors, that being the Egyptians and those in the Near East, leading up to the Akkadians, Persians, and others. So we know that their idea of chimerical crests, of guardian figures, of the poses of their statues, all derive from these earlier civilizations. Where we left off in ancient Greece on the mainland was the Bronze Age and the end of it, where we find the disintegration of social order leads to the Dark Ages around 1000 BCE. Here we have the disappearance of kings, where there is no linear A or B. Everyone is largely illiterate. We find depopulation and poverty occurring. There is no law and order. People are going to live in smaller and smaller communities or tribes until they're going to live basically in shacks or returning to the dwellings in the Neolithic period. It's only around the year 800 BCE that we begin to hear from the Greeks again. They begin trading, creating figures that are going to represent humans in their art, in figurines and painted on ceramics. We are now going to be entering the geometric period of ancient Greek. To illustrate the geometric period, here we have from the Hirschfeld workshop the funerary crater from the Dipylon Cemetery in Athens, from around 750 to 735 BCE. This massive crater, or a bowl designed for mixing punch for parties, you have a funerary scene. Now, during the geometric period, which lasts from 900 to 700 BCE, we have the primary decorative motifs focusing on geometric elements and geometricization. The crater here, used for mixing water and wine to dilute very strong wine for parties, is going to set over a grave. Therefore, it is a grave marker, or functions, as we would understand, of a tombstone or a stele. In this case, the bottom is open, allowing for drainage. So when it rains, it can drain through to the ground. Or, as in some cultures today, we pour ritualistic libations directly through it so the deceased can have it. Now the meander key pattern at the top of, or the lip of this vase, is going to be very common in the geometric era, where we find this interlocking set of geometric shapes, much like a maze, along the top, and none of the negative space is left. We fill it all in with these geometric shapes. The motif of the meander key pattern and of the funeral, with women pulling their hair and the deceased laying on the funeral pyre being covered by a shroud, is seen in many of these geometric craters and amphora, from cemeteries as they are grave markers. The linear and abstract motifs, which are common in the geometric era, are going to contrast greatly with the organic fluidity from the Minoan civilization. This is going to pick up where we left off on the Greek mainland with Mycenaean art, where we start seeing this reductive geometric approach, such as with the warrior's vase. The repetitive motifs and angularity are very common, and the same figures shown over and over again foretell this geometric simplicity, the idea of human figures carried out in a linear fashion instead of realistically. Every space in geometric decorated ceramics will be filled. There is no overlapping of the figures to suggest depth. That is rigidly avoided. And anytime there is space in between figures, it is filled in either with these flecks, geometric shapes, or other ornamentation. Now below we have a chariot procession in honor of the deceased, which is going to be common among these civilizations. We also have men who are carrying shields and spears in this procession, and women who pull their hair out, seen here above next to the funeral pyre. So the idea of having figures on a chariot with overlapping horses comes from the Sumerian civilization and is passed on through the ancient Egyptians. Having nude men, right, who are going to be carrying objects is also going to be common from their Near Eastern neighbors. The full frontal pose, or full profile pose, emphasizes these flat patterns. So we find that even though a dead man is lying on a funeral pyre here, and they're laying a funeral shroud over him with this abstract series of checker marks for a blanket, he is seen frontally, as though we are looking at him straight on, instead of in profile. The mourners around the funeral pyre are going to shroud the corpse from view. So just as the ancient Greeks would not show what the afterlife looks like, they're also going to cover up the deceased. They are out of view now. Males and females are distinguished very clearly, for females have breasts and males have penises. Therefore, from the outset of Greek art, they appreciate nudity more so than any other civilization we've looked at. Males and females are shown nude here, leading to just male figures being showed nude here shortly. The only emotional reactions are of the survivors. You'll notice that the dead is not shown in the afterlife. We have no connection to the dead in the Greek civilization, the afterlife being shrouded in mystery and darkness. The underworld is obscured for the Greeks very importantly. We do not have images of Hades or Tartarus. We do not show Hades generally in art, for to speak of death is going to bring it upon you. There are no supernatural beings or reference to the afterlife, and so the style that is adopted is one that celebrates liveliness and records the actions of those left alive here, not celebrating what happens after we die as in the Egyptian civilization. Because the Greeks avoided showing images of the underworld and the afterlife, we focus instead on the deeds of gods, demigods, and heroes, such as this hero and centaur here, possibly a Heracles and Nessus. Now, Heracles is the Greek term for Hercules. These two figures here bound by hand-to-hand struggle, locked in mortal combat. This is an action scene, if we of course read it as such. The centaur is going to be a half-man, half-horse, in this case Nessus, who famously carries off Heracles' bride Deianira when they're crossing a river. We notice, of course, that there is a broken spear tip in his back, as though Nessus is wounded. Here is another image illustrating how this famous scene previously was shown, with this hero battling this half-man, half-beast character. Now, the idea of showing the figures fully frontal or fully in profile is in keeping with geometric decoration at this time and era. So on the geometric crater as well, we find that the figures are shown frontally or from the side. Additionally, composite monsters are not new. The Greeks would have discovered these chimerical beasts when they renewed their contact with foreign cultures in the Near East, where we find the Assyrians and their lamassu, different types of sphinxes, and or other guardian figures. However, the centaur is a purely Greek invention. We find that no other culture in history invents the half-man, half-horse hybrid, of course showcasing how important horses were for the Greeks, which they were status symbols owned only by the aristocracy or the elite. With increased contact and having cylinder seals and these mythical composite creatures from the Near East and the Assyrians, we find that the Greeks developed their own, and centaurs are distinctly and uniquely Greek, as seen here from the 10th century BCE as well. Now, what is interesting about this work is, of course, the fact that both of these figures are shown nude, which you would not have seen in the ancient Near East. The natural beauty of the human figure is appreciated by the Greeks and will continue in the male nude in the following centuries. Now, these images are quite small. This is a statuette, and it would have been found in sanctuaries and used much like votive offerings to these gods. Heracles, of course, is going to make his way back up to Mount Olympus with his father Zeus after completing the 12 labors. So he would pray to him, sacrifice to him, as he was a model of suffering on this earth that we can follow, and of course succeed like he did of making it through. Now, just like on the Minoan island of Crete, we have these small statuettes of gods and or these votive offerings that are used to pray to these individual gods and deities. As trade increased with the Near East, Asia Minor, and Egypt in the Orientalizing period, which means the East or Eastern period, they have, from 700 to 600 BCE, a greater range of figures and types that are shown reflected in what we've looked at earlier, such as the Ishtar gates, as we looked at with Ladon and these other gods that are going to be shown in composite view. And this is the emergence of composite view when they see more of it from these other cultures. Now, the open composition and large motifs, as we find the further we go into Greek history, the larger these bands become until we'll have only one band eventually decorating these ceramic vessels. On it, we have real or imaginary animals with abstract plant forms or rosettes in the center, and often also decorated with human forms. The rosettes in between the figures in the negative space are stylized flowers, so they are still not yet comfortable with negative space. This black figure technique used to paint the animals that are going to include boars, swans, lions, and bulls are going to show that the figures are going to be black and they're on a pale buff or natural clay background. This will give way to red figure here shortly as far as the design is concerned. Not surprisingly, during the Orientalizing period, we also have the emergence of more figures that serve the same purpose as those in the Near East. For here we have a votive offering, and we know exactly what it is and its purpose due to the Greek inscription along the figure's thighs. Here it states, "Mantikolos dedicated me as a of the silver bow. You, Apollo, might give some pleasing favor in return." Hence, we believe that in his left hand he originally would have held a bow, thus identifying this votive offering as the god of the sun. Hence, it functions in much the same way as those votive figures that we looked at in Sumerian temples, such as the White Temple. Here we find that there is an increased amount of detail in the anatomy, and we can see that they begin differentiating the pectoral muscles, the clavicle, the abdominal muscles, and of course the figure is still nude, making it distinctly Greek. We also cannot tell the difference in either one of these statues in whether or not it is a god that is represented versus a human. That is because the perfect human is godlike for the Greeks. Now, males are most often shown nude from the earliest periods here in Greek history, but females are shown clothed, so they are very different than their predecessors in the prehistoric and ancient Aegean. Here we do not know if it is a goddess or a maiden, but both are called kore, singular, or korai, plural, which literally means a young woman. So the statue of this woman is going to, in either case of a goddess or a maiden, be shown clothed. Very often the right hand is going to be shown across the chest. This is a gesture of prayer for the ancient Greeks, much like the hands in the air to either side of the head would be the orant pose for early Christians. Thus the figure here is more naturalistic, but retains this love of patterns, as can be seen in her dress and hair of triangles and squares, much like the square shapes of Apollo's abdomen here. Now, Polit, in his reading, is going to argue that these represent the fundamental Greek aesthetic principles, which, number one, values an analysis of forms, breaking them into their component parts, otherwise known as symmetria and rhythmos in Greek. Secondly, these are going to be expressed in the essentials of nature over the specific. Hence, this is where we get the development of the notion of Platonic forms, as opposed to dance examples here on Earth. The kouros, or kouroi plural, are the first monumental stone statues seen in Greece, and they emerge in the Archaic period around 600 BCE. These statues of young, nude males are going to idealize this youthful, athletic figure, symbolizing one's ancestors and thus your fertility. They do not represent individuals and are not individualized. We have a type here of a male figure standing rigidly upright, smiling, with stylized hair and an archaic smile. This archaic smile indicates to the Greeks that the figure is alive, not that the figure is happy, because these are going to act grave markers. So this replaces the geometric crater we looked at earlier as the dominant grave marker in ancient Greece, for this would act as a tombstone being over one's burial. The position of the figure should remind you at this point of Egyptian art because it imports that Egyptian canon, whereby we have a rigidly upright male figure with fists to either side of his thighs, with left foot forward, right foot back. Rigidly upright as well, shoulders level, and once again, his hips and shoulders are parallel to one another. This is, of course, a less lifelike version of what's happening at the same time in Egypt that the Greeks would have access to because they're trading with the Egyptians. It is close-lipped, it is stylized and abstracted. The Greeks at this point still have the remnants of the geometric style and its characteristics in their vocabulary, whereby we have repeated shapes and angles, such as the triangle of the pelvis and the triangle of the ribcage. This love of patterns is going to carry through and will explain why the Greeks are going to advance in fields of mathematics and geometry. They look for patterns in nature. Again, the figure is male and nude. Thus, we find that these are indistinguishable from gods that are being portrayed at the same time. The only reason we know a figure is a god in the Greek culture is the context in which it is shown and or the object it is holding. So Poseidon would be shown with his trident, or Zeus with his thunderbolt, or Apollo with his bow and arrow.
Developing alongside their male counterparts, the female kore also are going to become more naturalistic, yet they are still going to be clothed. Thus, the understanding of the female anatomy is going to be slow in development and does not really become more evolved until the classical era. Here with the Berlin kore, we have one set up at a cemetery. So we do not know again whether or not this is a priestess, attendant, or a goddess. It generally depends. So we have a pomegranate in the right hand here. Therefore, it is a symbol of Persephone, the bride of the underworld of Hades, who was abducted and taken against her will. Here we find that the drapery masks the body, and the patterns are going to mimic the contours of her form. Thus, the love of patterns is still dominant and is going to be stronger than the need to show something naturalistically. As with all of these figures, it would have originally been painted in encaustic, with this pigment and polychrome to look as lifelike as possible.
Moving forward in the Archaic era, we have a radical stylistic evolution occurring in a very short time. Here in the Next Generasis, we have the Kroisos, which is of course going to be the name of an individual over the grave that this is found. Here we have a symbolic type, again, not a specific likeness. So we have many of these kuroi that are going to be scattered throughout the Greek world, through all the colonies and the Greek mainland. At the base of this statue, we have the inscription, much like you would find on a stele, marking when someone had died. It reads, "Stay and mourn at the tomb of dead Kroisos, who raging Ares destroyed one day as he fought in the foremost ranks." In it, we have a life-size sculpture that is painted, polychromed, as naturalistic as possible in encaustic, which, if you remember, is going to be pigment crushed and ground into hot wax. This is the ideal pigment and medium for painting sculptures that would be outside, that would be outdoors, exposed to the elements. So it is amazing that after millennia, the paint remains in different sections. Now, if we compare this kuros to the earlier one, we find that the figure has been fleshed out. We have greater attention paid to the muscular system here, whereby we find the abdominal muscles are detailed and separated from the pectoral muscles, that we find clavicles are detailed and separated from the trapezius. Deltoid, tricep, and bicep are all going to be differentiated. We even have an overemphasis on the fleshiness of the hips here. But we still see, regardless, this move towards a greater interest in anatomical accuracy. The archaic smile is still dominant here in kuroi throughout the Archaic period, and that's how we know it comes from and derives from this period. We are showing this grave marker over the soldier who died in battle, killed by the god Ares, who will become Mars in the Roman tradition, where we get our word march, for you go to war in March. Turning to representations of women, the Greeks are going to be very hesitant to show them nude in the Archaic period onward. In fact, we do not see female nudity in goddesses or upper-class women and subjects until we reach the late Classical era. Here we have one of the most common types of a kore, which is a young female, which is also a type, just like the kuros, in which the women will always be clothed, showing little interest in the anatomy underneath. Now, the kore is going to differentiate the female figure from the male because she will always be more fleshy and rounded, but still smiling like her male counterpart, that archaic smile identifying her as being produced between 600 and 480 BCE. The peplos kore here, named for the peplos garment, which is a four-piece garment that a goddess would wear or a priestess who worships a goddess. This is in fact a votive offering in Athena's sanctuary that we can identify generally only from the object that she would hold in her left hand out towards the viewer. And remember, in these sanctuaries, only priests or acolytes are allowed inside. So we find that the activities in ancient Greco-Roman worship occur outside of the temples in which these are. Just like the male counterpart, the kore are also encaustic polychromed or painted with beeswax very brightly, which is jarring for modern sensibilities to think of these white, stark marble or terracotta statues were originally painted very brightly with white skin, red lips, and then the bright dress that we would find as a holdover from the Minoan culture that appreciated this bright clashing series of colors.
As has been true with all of the Kore we've looked at, we find that they very often hold ceremonial objects, either, once again, these globular offering jars, or those that associate them with particular goddesses, like the pomegranate, for instance, with Persephone.
Now, as with all Kore, the female form will always be shown as softer and fleshier, and that it is naturalistic, but certainly not as much interest is paid to the anatomy as the male versions. Now, these types of statues would be seen in a new type of temple invented by the Greeks, for Egyptian monuments are going to be built to glorify godlike rulers, such as the pharaohs. Here we have a massive tomb to the pharaoh. Greek temples, however, are built to worship individual gods who are immortal humans, and are decorated with a sculptural ensemble in the exterior. They are understood as giant sculptures we are to walk around. An archaic example of these temples can be found in the Greek colony Paestum here. And here we have, just southeast of Pompeii, a well-preserved series of temples, including the Temple of Hera I. In this temple, named as such because there is another temple to Hera nearby, we have an approximation of what the original structure would have looked like, sans or without the terracotta tiled roof, which has since dissolved, rotted, and faded away. The temple is 170 feet long by 80 feet wide. The interior space would have been taken up with one room or a cella, with a single statue to the goddess Hera on the inside. This is a peripteral temple, as are most Greek temples in the Archaic and Classical periods. A peripteral temple, by definition, is a triangular structure with freestanding columns on all four sides. On the inside, we have a room which is reserved for the cult statue of the god or goddess it's dedicated to. The further development and refinement of the post and lintel system can be found here, and will remain the ultimate expression of architecture until the Romans invent concrete. The idea of freestanding columns, again, the Greeks are going to adopt from ancient Egypt, who began these investigations into monumental stone edifices with the stepped pyramid at Saqqara, and eventually evolved into circular cylindrical columns that would support a lintel or a horizontal element. The Greeks are going to have three orders of architecture that will determine the style, size, design, and orientation of the building it's attached to. These are going to be Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The Doric order is the least decorative. It has the broadest column, and it does not have a decorative capital. It's going to sit directly on a cornice and will often be decorated with triglyphs or metopes. On the upper section, we have a pediment, that triangular section that tops the structure. The Doric order is known as the masculine order. It is the most serious and severe order. Thus, it is generally reserved for temples, such as the Temple of Hera I. Developing later from Ionia on the mainland in Turkey today, we have the Ionic order. The Ionic order is going to be more slender, taller, more decorative. It has volutes here, these spirals and the capitals, and is going to have a more decorative cornice, and generally is going to be decorated with a relief frieze. This is the androgynous order, as it's going to be between male and female. It is an effeminate male, if you will. Finally, the Corinthian order is going to be the tallest, the most slender, the most decorative, with abacus scrolls here, and then a series of cornices above. It is seen as the feminine order because it is the most elaborately decorative. Now, for temples, obviously the severity and strength necessary to create them are appropriate for the male order, the Doric order. And we notice that the columns are also not going to be completely straight or vertical. They're going to bow outwards in the center. This entasis, as it's known, is a slight curvature that is going to correct the optical distortion that we see with straight lines, so that it is not technically straight, but it will look that way when you're standing in front of it. Now, in ancient Greek religion, we find that, unlike Christianity or Judaism, we, the congregation or the laity, the common people in a town, do not go inside the temple. Only priests and or their acolytes are allowed inside to talk to the gods. We are on the outside, thus there is a lot of decoration and decorative elements on the exterior of Greek temples, generally showing the gods and or great wars. Now, we are on the exterior, and so we find that the altar is also going to be on the outside, and this is the public sacrifice of generally a bull or a pig. Now, we know the altar is going to be on the east end, thus facing the sun, as are the case for many religions. The Greeks also, with the Romans, Christians, and Egyptians, will be sun worshippers. The temple proper is going to house the cult statue of whatever god or goddess it is dedicated to. One temple for one god. So in this case, we would have seen a cult statue of Hera on the inside. And so we can pray directly to her effigy. Now, the Greek temple design, it is important to note, is mathematically balanced and harmonious, meant to reflect the harmony of the cosmos, and is seen to be mathematically related to the universe, which we can understand again through mathematics.
While the Temple of Hera I is a good example of archaic temple design, it does not retain the original relief sculptures, either in the metopes or in the pediment. For an archaic example of these decorations, we turn to Delphi. Now, Delphi is home to the most religious and revered religious site in all of Greece, which is the sanctuary of Apollo and the Delphic oracle, who is going to speak for Apollo. So Apollo is going to speak directly to the oracle, who then very cryptically tells the priests of what he is communicating. So the Pythia, as this oracle is called, receives no training, but is a medium or shaman, as we understand that, who would inhale vapors from a chasm below, as geologists have found, or chewed hallucinogenic laurel leaves in order to become in another state of mind, in order to communicate with the divine more effectively. She would sit on a bronze tripod while the male priest asked the questions of whoever came to get the favor of Apollo. But of course, a sacrifice needed to be made by the inquirer. At that time, the Pythia would then answer, and the priest would recast in dialectic hexameters. Here in the Scythian treasury, we have, at the sanctuary of Apollo, a remnant of archaic relief sculpture in a gigantomachy. Now, the Ionic temple, which was a sanctuary of Apollo, would house the votive offerings given to the god and to ensure his favor, given that he is the god of the sun and also is going to strike people down with his plague arrows. He would be one you would want to have the favor of. The caryatids on the front of the temple are going to be female figures that are carved in the shape of columns. This will be very common. We will see it carried on again with the Acropolis in Athens, with the Erechtheion, the most famous example of caryatids throughout ancient Greece. Atlantids, as we covered, are going to be columns carved as men. We looked at that in the Temple of Ramses II in ancient Egypt and the New Kingdom. Now, as the temple will be divided into different elements, primarily the column below, which is the post and lintel system, which supports an entablature, which is the horizontal element that supports the roof. We finally have the pediment or triangular section at the top. Now, the pediment and entablature both can have decorations on them, either of freestanding or relief sculpture. In this instance, at the Scythian treasury, we have a gigantomachy, which is merely 2 feet tall, but a good example of the cacophonous and violent action that is preferred in the archaic era before giving way to the solemn quiet before the storm of the classical era. Here, the figures would have originally been polychromed as they battle one another, this following the Titanomachy. After the Olympians successfully overthrow their parents, the Titans, then the Mother Earth, or Gaia, sends these giants, these beasts, against the Olympians in one final battle before Typhon is going to fight Zeus personally. Here we have an example of the type of polychromy that would have existed, painting the background in blue, which we know through X-ray and refractography. Here at the right, as they are labeled, we have Apollo and Artemis, who are going to be fleeing these giants and then fighting them in the next scene. We have overlapping depth here and a varying depth of carving, which gives us a much more effective understanding of the violent action that is occurring in this massive battle. The painted figures are going to be labeled, and the clarity of the placement and their action is paramount to the Greeks of this time, so that we can identify each one. And this will be true all the way through till the end of ancient Greece. Now, the end of the Archaic period, shown here with a rapid evolution from the hero and centaur from the Geometric era, shows us an interest in motion and spatial complexity that evolves incredibly rapidly, only in a few generations, as it were. Here we have monumental stone architecture and sculpture that defines this period.
Next time, we will continue on with the development of archaic vase painting and the monumental leaps forward made there, and the transition to the classical, as we find at the end of the archaic era in 480 BCE, taking into account a greater pathos and anatomical correctness.